Thank you for that very, very kind introduction. It's really nice to be here. I'm really pleased. I wanted to do this talk here for a while, so I'm really glad we put it together. So I guess I'll start by, I don't need to introduce myself. Thank you, Giovanna. I'll start by saying I'm sure you all use generative AI. You probably do. There are three key resources that generative AI companies tend to need to build great models. People, compute, and data. So like engineers to build the models, GPUs to run the training process, and training data to train the models on. And over the last few years, AI companies have spent huge amounts of money on the first two. So they as you may know, if you're a tech person, they offer up to $1 million per year per engineer, sometimes more. Astronomically high salaries. Training runs can cost $1 billion. To train a model can cost $1 billion. But many of these companies expect to take the third resource, training data, for free, and are taking it for free. And so my work at the moment is focused on that desire of some AI companies to exploit the work of the world's creators for free. And today I'm mostly going to talk about music, since that's what I've worked on the most. But this applies equally to all media types and most generative AI models at the moment. So I'm going to start by talking about an AI music company that's called Suno. You may have heard of it. It's one of the more famous AI music companies. I launched in December 2023. At that time, I had recently quit this British AI company called Stability AI, where I'd run the audio team there. We'd actually released a model that Giovanna mentioned, an AI music generation model, which was trained on music that we'd licensed. We paid for. The licensing is a thing that a few AI companies do. I'm a huge believer in the importance of licensing the training data, as I'll discuss today. I quit the company because the wider organization outside of the music team didn't share that view and made that clear in a response to the US Copyright Office, and that's why I quit. And so anyway, in March 2024, Suno released their version 3 model, which started getting more hype in like the AI influencer crowd, started getting people paying attention to it. They raised a lot of money. There was a big piece in Rolling Stone magazine, which said, hang on, I'm not quite there yet, which said, Suno's founders declined to reveal details of just what data they are shoveling into their model. That was the quote from that thing. So basically, Suno's founders were not telling people what their model was trained on. So at this point, I wrote an article in Music Business Worldwide, trade magazine you probably won't read. Nothing against them, they're amazing, but if you're not in the music business, you probably don't read them. And I shared some of the outputs from Suno that I had got using the product, and I'm going to play you a couple. So the prompt here for this song I generated, the prompt was a rap song by an artist called Beminem. Yo, listen up, this is Eminem on the mic, dropping rhymes that hit with all my mic. Yeah. I spit fire, make the crowd go wild. Now, you may be too young to know who Eminem is, but if you do know who Eminem is, you may recognize that voice. For another song, I used the prompt 70s British rock, and I pasted in the lyrics to Bohemian Rhapsody. This is what I got for the section. If you know that song, there's a bit that goes, Galileo, and this is what I got. So, and using the same technique, I got outputs that use similar melodies to the corresponding points in various original copyrighted songs, like Oasis' Wonderwall, which is a personal favorite of mine, Smokey Robinson's Tracks of My Tears, and many more. And so all in all, I found that Suno generated output that resembled copyrighted music across a range of aspects: melodies, chord progressions, lyrics, instrumental parts, musical styles. And as I said at the time in this article, I think at the least this raised serious questions about what they in fact trained their models on. So I published that article, it was picked up a fair bit, and a week later, another AI music company launched called Udio. This is like the second AI music company of the moment. And I read about the launch, and the company, again, like Suno, the company declined to answer when they were asked what they trained on. So the journalist said, what did you train on? They declined to answer. What they did say was, we obviously have tremendous respect for artists and all that sort of thing. which I thought was a particularly interestingly worded quote. So I wrote another article in Music Business Worldwide, sharing some of the outputs from Udio that I got. So let's listen to a couple of these. This phrase where I set the lyrics sounds. I mean, you'll hear it, but it sounds very similar to the equivalent phrase from ABBA's Dancing Queen. And so if you actually look at the transcription here, on We Can Jive, you've got the same basic melody on the same pitches relative to the key, you've got the same rhythm, with one tiny alteration introducing syncopation, and even the harmonizing vocal part actually uses the same pitches as those in the original. It's like crazy levels of similarity. And that's not to mention the sound of the voices. I don't have many more examples, but I like them. Here's the output that I got just using the prompt, the first 4 lines of a famous song by a band that rhymes with bold play, continued in a new way. And it was all yellow, your skin, yeah, your skin and bones turned into something beautiful. So a familiar sounding voice there again, and familiar lyrics. So with these articles, I wasn't trying to highlight examples of sort of AI regurgitating copyrighted music in order to say that that regurgitation was a copyright infringement. We get a bit technical here, but I was sharing these examples to try to inform the discussion over what these companies' training data was. They weren't disclosing. So 2 months later, in June, the RIAA, which is the body that represents 3 major record labels, sued these 2 companies for what they called copyright infringement on an almost unimaginable scale. These lawsuits are still ongoing, and I want to talk a bit about these lawsuits. So the lawsuits basically say, it's obvious that you've trained on our music, and that's massive copyright infringement. So it turns out that the RIAA or the labels or someone has emailed Suno to accuse them of training on their music. And Suno not only didn't deny it, but they even said that their large-scale copying of sound recordings is fair use. I'll get onto what fair use is. But the RIAA goes further. It doesn't just have the founders' words. They tested these products just like I had. And here are my final couple of examples, because these are the ones actually in the lawsuits. Here are some of the Suno outputs that the RIAA included in their lawsuits. So this is what they got using this prompt. Can't see the prompt. And the lyrics of Johnny Be Good. So the orange notes here are notes where either the pitch or the rhythm is the same as in the original song. And the red notes are where both the pitch and the rhythm are the same as in the original song. And I'll play this output. Now, I don't know if you know the song Johnny Be Good. I hope you do. And my final example is what they got with the prompt 1954 rock and roll Bill Haley Comets and the lyrics to the classic Rock Around the Clock.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock,
Look out.
rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock, go round the clock tonight. Push your glad.
So there are lots more examples in the lawsuits. Same thing for Udio. So now we're getting to the end of our timeline of these 2 companies. So in August last year, Suno and Udio responded to these lawsuits. And one of the most interesting things about their responses is that they actually essentially admitted to training on the record label's music, sort of at last, I guess. So Suno said, it's no secret that the tens of millions of recordings the Suno's model was trained on presumably included recordings whose rights are owned by the plaintiffs, in this case, the record labels. And in fact, they go further and say Suno's training data includes essentially all music files of reasonable quality that are accessible on the open internet. Now, they say it was no secret, but I don't think they'd ever admitted it before, despite being asked about their training data multiple times. I've actually gone back and checked, and so to give you the whole picture, here's what I could find. And I think this is interesting because I think this question of sort of AI companies hiding what they're training on is a very interesting question. So here's what I could find. They said it's no secret that tens of millions of recordings. I sort of went through everything they'd said. Here's what I found. On the 9th of November the previous year, Suno's CEO was asked in an interview directly, were song lyrics part of the data set? And is that something you worry about legally? He didn't answer the question. You know, he said it looks like every big AI company gets sued, and he said, you know, he just said a bunch of other stuff that didn't answer the question. 14th of March last year, another interview. The interviewer brought up the data wars, specifically another lawsuit, New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI. And the interviewer says, "How do you think about that? There's obviously a lot of copyright-free music out there, etc." Again, Suno CEO doesn't talk about the music they train on, just talks about speech. And finally, a week or so later, there's a big piece in Rolling Stone that says Suno's founders declined to reveal details of what data they're shoving into their model. So again, I mean, and I couldn't find anywhere where they'd admitted it. I don't think there is anywhere. So I'm not, you know. Anyway, finally, the RIAA, end of this story, the RIAA responds to this in August last year. And they say, after months of evading and misleading, defendants have finally admitted their massive unlicensed copying of artist recordings. It's a major concession of facts they spent months trying to hide and acknowledge only when forced by a lawsuit. So I think you can read this back and forth. You can make your own kind of decisions about, you know, who's in the right. Lawsuits are ongoing. But I think it's an interesting story. So why have I gone into so much detail here about one or two AI companies and their attitudes to training data? And the reason is because you see the same patterns playing out across the entire generative AI landscape. AI companies suspected to train on huge amounts of copyrighted work, avoiding questions about this until they're taken to court, and then claiming that it's fair use. And again, we'll get to fair use. So why should we care? Why does it matter if generative AI companies don't license their training data, if they just take it all from the internet? And I'll tell you why I think it matters. I think it matters because unlicensed training on creative work has serious negative consequences for the people behind that work. And this is for the simple reason that generative AI competes with the work that it's trained on and the people behind that work. Now, this is not the narrative that AI founders like myself, I've been one of the past, that we like to portray. We like to say AI democratizes creativity. We're letting more people be creative. I've said that on stage when asked this very question. I'm sort of ashamed to say. But the fact that generative AI competes with its training data is entirely inescapable. A large language model trained on short stories can create competing short stories. An image model trained on stock photos can create competing stock photos. An AI music model trained on music from TV shows can create competing music to license to TV shows. These models are so quick and easy to use, I'm sure you're all well aware, that this competition is inevitable. And interestingly, it's not just theoretical either. Generative AI is still pretty new, so we don't have the large-scale studies that we need yet on the competitive effects of generative AI, but already we're seeing exactly the sorts of effects you'd expect in a world where generative AI competes with its training data. I'll give you a couple of examples. The well-known filmmaker Ram Gopal Varma has said that he will use AI music in all his films going forward. Numerous music fans already report listening to AI music in place of human-produced music. I spend more time on Suno now than Spotify, like all these sorts of things, right? You see this all the time. People have had AI music recommended to them on Discover Weekly on Spotify. This also happens a lot. Now, the Suno CEO has said, we're not trying to give the tools to make a song with our stuff and put it on Spotify. But I think a good question here to ask is define trying, because it is undeniable that that is what Suno has done. Songs generated on Suno are all over Spotify. And it was always obvious to anyone who's worked in AI music that this was going to be a key way people would use these text-to-music products. Here are just a random selection of people saying, hey, look, I used Suno, or whatever it was, to put my music on Spotify. Here's the album available. We actually now have some numbers, not from Spotify, but from Deezer. In January this year, 10,000 AI songs were uploaded to Deezer every day. 10,000 songs, that's 10% of the songs uploaded to Deezer were fully AI generated. As of April, a couple of weeks ago, that had increased to 20,000 songs a day. 20% of all songs being uploaded to Deezer every day, fully generated by AI. you can expect similar numbers across other streaming services that will not release these numbers. You also see things like this. AI song recently reached number 48 in the German charts, not a bad showing. In all of these cases, it's abundantly clear that AI music competes with the work it's trained on. You know, that's not really in question. Or take, you know, a good example, I think, is Kelly McKernan. Kelly is an artist I actually know from Nashville. For 10 years, they sold enough of their work to make art their full-time living. But then in 2022, a data set that included 50 of their works was used to train Midjourney, an image generator, data set called Lion. And so Kelly's name became one of many artist names that started being used by huge numbers of people to generate art in the style of specific human artists. This is how Kelly found out about it. Kelly's name started appearing everywhere. Kelly's income fell by 33% almost overnight. Illustrators around the world report similar stories being outcompeted by image models, AI image models that they suspect were trained on their work. And so the freelance platform Upwork actually wrote a white paper on the effects of generative AI that they've seen on the job market. They looked at how job postings on their platform have changed in the wake of the introduction of ChatGPT. And they found exactly what you'd expect. Freelance postings for freelance writing decrease almost immediately following the introduction of ChatGPT, decreased by 8%. And that actually rose to 18% when they only considered what they termed low-value tasks. You see the same, incidentally, in image generation. Studies have shown the graphic design postings fell by, in fact, the same 18% on the launch of AI image generators. Of course they did. People are using these things instead of commissioning an illustrator. I mean, it's what you'd expect. We have the data. So the initial data we have, plus all these stories we hear, all aligns with the logical assumption. Generative AI, by being quick and easy to use, you know, all of its benefits, but because of all those benefits, it competes with the work it's trained on and the people behind that work. And that is the key. If you take one thing from today, I would recommend you try to remember that. Doesn't mean don't use generative AI. I don't recommend not using it, but I think it's important to remember that. Creators and rights holders, I spent a lot of time talking to them. I'm a composer myself. They argue that training AI models on copyrighted work without a license is illegal. The legal framework of copyright affords creators the exclusive right to authorize copies of their work being made, and generative AI training involves copying at multiple stages, involves machines copying things. That's to say nothing of the output of the models, just even training the model involves a ton of copying. So the defense that's often put forward by AI companies is that generative AI training falls under the fair use copyright exception. And this is the argument that both Suno and Udio made in their responses to the lawsuits. A ton of other companies have made it, I think, including OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, Anthropic. I think even Adobe has said this. A bunch of companies have said this. The fair use copyright exception essentially allows unlicensed copying in certain circumstances. A good example is when you're creating parodies of a work. That's often fair use. It means you don't have to go and get a license for every use of copyrighted work. These decisions on whether something is a fair use of a copyrighted work are made on a case-by-case basis, and there are 4 factors that go into them: the purpose and the character of the use, the nature of the work in question, the amount of the work that's being used, and the effect of the use on the potential market for and value of that work. So AI companies argue training is fair use. What does the other side think? Well, I'll give you 2 examples. One is from an essay published last year by a former OpenAI researcher, Suchir Balaji, who quit the company. He quit saying OpenAI is infringing copyright. Suchir is very sadly no longer with us, but his resignation and statements on fair use were hugely appreciated by the artistic community. Now, I won't read out some of these. Factors 1 and 4 are generally understood to be the most important when it comes to the generative AI question. Regarding factor 4, the effect of the use on the market for the work, Suchir points out that the traffic to Stack Overflow declined by about 12% after the release of ChatGPT. So regarding factor 4, he said there clearly can be market effects from ChatGPT on its training data. Totally agree. And also that given the existence of a data licensing market, people licensing their works to AI companies, which happens a lot already, training on copyrighted data without a similar licensing agreement is also a type of market harm, because it deprives the copyright holder of that source of revenue. And regarding factor 1, he said ChatGPT answers serve the same basic purpose as Stack Overflow answers. So he concludes his essay, none of the 4 factors seem to weigh in favor of ChatGPT being a fair use of its training data. The other example I'll give is a paper by the esteemed legal scholar Jacqueline Charlesworth. It's called Generative AI's Illusory Case for Fair Use. And she says that AI companies say their use of copyrighted works is, they use this word transformative, and they hope this strengthens their claim. Indeed, actually, the CEO of Suno has said our technology is transformative. This is a thing companies often say. And it's kind of easy to believe because you think, yeah, I guess there's some transformation going on. But that's not what the word means. Charlesworth points out that AI training is not transformative in the legal sense of the word. She says, for purposes of fair use, a transformative use is one that adds something new with a further purpose or different character and does not supplant the original. The transformativeness of the use in each of these cases, she's talking about like a regular cited case, turned on the fact that aesthetic content was not being exploited for its own sake. And she goes on to say, copying of protected works by generative AI systems has no similar claim to transformativeness. Works are copied in their entirety, mechanically encoded into the model. They're copied to capture their expressive value. So what she's saying is, it doesn't matter that generative AI makes something that sounds different. That's not what transformative means in legal terms. Companies are training on music that people listen to in order to create new music that people listen to. It's the same purpose. It's not transformative. She concludes, unauthorized copying by AI companies to build and operate Gen AI systems is not quintessential fair use. There is no precedent that legitimizes mass copying and exploitation of the expressive content of creative works by for-profit entities. And for the record, and this will probably be obvious, and it's just my opinion, I think that both Suchir and Jacqueline are 100% right. Now, there are currently more than 40 ongoing lawsuits in the US alone, brought by rights holders against AI companies trying to tackle this question. And that will help resolve this question because it's untested in the courts. It's all new. Lawsuits will take time, and creators are suffering from what they see as unjust competition right now. So they propose a simple solution that's worked before, licensing. You know, if you're a commercial entity, you want to make use of copyrighted work, if you're a streaming service, or maybe you're manufacturing merchandise, whatever you want to do, you license the work in question. So AI companies provide a number of arguments for why they shouldn't license their training data. Some of these are arguments that they just don't have to. There's the fair use legal defense I've already mentioned. There's also the argument, and you may have heard this, people say it quite a lot. There's the argument that, well, humans learn from copyrighted work without a license, so why shouldn't AI companies? I hear this a lot. I think it's an incredibly hard claim to justify. It was actually, again, used by company Suno, just like a kid writing their own rock songs after listening to the genre. Learning is not infringing. It never has been, and it is not now. But the problem is, we as creators, we've been learning from each other for centuries, right? It's baked into the social contract. When we create, we expect that people are going to learn from us. We also, when we learn, that comes from a bunch of different sources. It comes from classes, might come from university courses, textbooks, visiting museums, whatever it is. Pretty much all of this, someone at some step, someone has paid for supporting the entire ecosystem. It may not be you, it may be you. It supports the ecosystem. In generative AI, commercial entities valued at millions or billions of dollars scrape as much content as they can from the internet without paying a cent, without paying a single cent often. They do so against the wishes of many, many creators. They make multiple copies along the way, which are all subject to copyright law. And in doing so, they build a hyper scalable competitor to what they're training on. So scalable that, you know, there are image generators making, I forget, I think I've got it written down here, 2.5 million images a day. Song generators making 10 songs a second. So arguing, I think, that human learning and AI training are the same and should be treated the same is preposterous. Another common argument that language model providers in particular put forward is that licensing all their training data would be impractical. They say these models need so much training data that payments to each individual creator would be small, but this is true in many content licensing markets. Creators still want to get paid even if the payments are small. I can tell you that for free. They also say it's too much data to feasibly license. Licensing is too hard. But to the people who claim this, I say, how hard have you actually tried? You know, as a data point, Udio was founded in December 2023, and launched in April 2024. A few months. Did they try to license their data in that short period of time? Maybe they did. Speaking from experience, 4 months would have been an extremely short time for licensing negotiations to play out and presumably fall apart. Creators and rights holders are willing to license their work for AI training. Across the generative AI space, there have been around 30 major reported deals between rights holders and AI companies in the last year alone. And that's to say nothing of the smaller deals that don't get reported. There are also training data marketplaces where you can go to get more data. If you want to expand your data set to train on, you can go and use public domain data. Like if you're a large language model provider, you can go use the 500 billion word public domain data set common corpus in which no copyright exists. You can expand that with synthetic data, which is data that's made by a generative AI model. So there are many, many answers to how you can get training data without simply scraping copyrighted work without permission. So I think the argument that licensing data is impossible, which lots of companies say, especially large language model providers, is I think very weak. But the strongest evidence that licensing all your training data is actually possible is that there are already AI companies doing it. I know because I've done it myself. I've been building what we now call generative AI since long before we did call it that, since 2010. And as Giovanna mentioned, in 2023, my team at Stability AI built a model that one of Time's best inventions of the year that was trained on music we'd licensed. And other companies and other models have done the same. And so I started Fairly Trained, a nonprofit, in order to highlight this fact and these companies. Fairly Trained is a nonprofit. What we do is we certify generative AI models that don't train on copyrighted work without a license. We launched in January last year. We've certified about 20 models so far, more in the pipeline. And these companies get their training data in like a variety of ways. You know, we've got an AI voice model, an AI voice company that's gone and licensed a bunch of individual voices to train on. We have an AI music company that's licensed more than 40 music catalogs for training. We have a large language model that's only trained on public domain works. Some of these companies pay up front for their training data. Some of them do revenue shares with rights holders, which is often a good way of getting a deal done. There's no like silver bullet for how these licensing agreements work. The beauty of licensing is that two parties can come together and figure out what works for them. And this is, you know, this is happening more and more. You know, you'll hear people say that a requirement to license data sort of stifles innovation. There's only the big companies that can afford this training data, these huge costs. But it's simply not true. And actually, if you look at it, it's the startups who are coming along and actually trying to license all their data that the major AI companies have been around a while aren't even trying. And the people who are doing it are often doing it by doing things like revenue shares, where you don't have to give a huge upfront fee, where being a small company is fine. So it's perfectly possible. So what do other people make of all this? Well, one thing some AI companies like to do is make it out like the opposition to what they're doing here is just coming from like dinosaur, massive rights holder companies. For example, Suno have said, each and every time there's been innovation in music, the record labels have attempted to limit progress. And Udio have said, our mission is to empower artists of all kinds to create extraordinary music. So there's always this talk of empowering artists, major rights holders trying to hamper this. But I've spoken to a lot of musicians about this. And I know that it's not just these big rights holders who are angry about AI companies taking their work without permission to build competitors to them. I recently spoke at the annual meeting of the Society of Composers and Lyricists in LA, for example. And what I heard from these composers was nothing short of desperation about what's happening. So in October last year, I wrote a short 29-word statement as an open letter. It read, the unlicensed use of creative works for training generative AI is a major unjust threat to the livelihoods of the people behind those works and must not be permitted. This open letter has already been signed by more than 50,000 people. I encourage you to have a look through the list of signatories. People list their professions. Signatories include Nobel Prize winning authors, Academy Award winning actors, Oscar winning composers, Bjorn Ulvaeus from ABBA, Tom York from Radiohead, Roger Daltrey from The Who, Max Richter, members of Hot Chip, Portishead, up-and-coming bands, classical composers, film composers. But the list is mostly populated by working creative professionals whose names you probably don't know. Composers, producers, singers, instrumentalists, filmmakers, artists, journalists, the list goes on, actors. 50,000 people who don't think that what's happening here is empowering them. And before this, there were other similar statements. 15,000 authors objected to unlicensed training. 250 musicians, including Billie Eilish, Katy Perry, Nicki Minaj, John Bon Jovi, did the same. All of these statements make it abundantly clear. These artists, these creators, view generative AI that is trained on their work without permission as totally unjust and likely to have a catastrophic effect on their professions. And polls of creators reveal the same overwhelming strength of feeling against unlicensed training. In a poll of more than 4,000 songwriters, composers, and publishers in Australia and New Zealand last summer, 95% said that copyright holders must be asked permission before training. 93% called for payment. When the UK Society of Authors asked their members for their thought, 97% rejected AI companies' claim that they can train on copyrighted work without a license. In all of these polls, you basically see 90% plus of creators obviously call for permission and payment to be required for AI training. So I like to tell AI advocates for unlicensed AI training, of which there are many, especially here in Silicon Valley, remember that the people who wrote the songs you're listening to and the books you're reading almost certainly disagree with you. It's really important to remember that. And it will probably come as no surprise that the general public, too, disagree with AI companies' views on what they can train on. One poll from the AI Policy Institute last April asked people about the common policy among AI companies of training on what they call publicly available work. So that's stuff on the open internet, which obviously includes loads of copyrighted work, like newspaper articles that aren't paywalled. It includes a bunch of copyrighted material. There's a ton of copyrighted stuff out there that's being trained on. When the public was asked about this in this poll, 60% said no, you shouldn't be allowed to train on that. Only 19% said you should. And then when the same poll asked people, well, should this training data be paid for? 74% said yes, and only 9% said no. Time and time again, when the public is asked these questions, they show overwhelming support for requirements of payment and permission in AI training, and a rejection of this notion that because you've put something on the internet, somehow AI companies are allowed to use it. And I think an important thing to remember here is that we creators have been putting work online for decades because we've all been told to for exposure. There is no way that act of putting something online, making it publicly available like that, can be taken as some sort of tacit agreement that AI companies can then commercialize that in order to outcompete. I think arguing that it can is a ridiculous argument. And I'm going to give you one more reason that I think AI companies should license their data. That's probably not relevant to you, but I think it's worth bearing in mind. If nothing has convinced you so far, then think about this. Right now, many of the world's creators, musicians, artists, writers, you may be aware of this, you may not, probably are, straight up hate generative AI. A pure, unfettered hatred. The backlash in creative communities to generative AI is already huge, and it is still growing, and I think it will continue to grow. Some examples of this. Heretic, a film that came out in late 2024, had this notice in its end credits. You're seeing this more and more. No generative AI was used in the making of this film. Its director said AI is an algorithm jumbling a bunch of shit together and then spitting it out as art. It's not human, and it's borderline failed. James Gunn, the CEO of DC Comics, had this to say about an AI-generated Superman trailer vomit emoji, vomit emoji, vomit emoji. NaNoWriMo, which, if you don't know, is kind of National Novel Writing Month. When everyone writes a novel in November, been going for years, faced a massive backlash when it called the condemnation of AI classist and ableist. Two members of its writers' board immediately resigned. NaNoWriMo has since shut down. At South by Southwest last year, the entire crowd booed a pro-AI ad that came on before a film showing. There was such a strong backlash to a planned showing of an AI-generated film at a cinema in London that the cinema had to cancel it. And Doctor Who in the UK rolled back generative AI experiments rapidly after so many people protested. The list goes on. People experiment with generative AI in their creative work, and I have nothing against experimentation. But people do it and are immediately called out for it in the strongest possible terms by huge numbers of creators. And don't be fooled into thinking this is just the latest example of creators responding badly to new technology. This isn't like the reaction to recorded music or to the camera or to the synthesizer. This is much, much stronger, much broader, and much more visceral. And we can see from creators' own words that one reason for this is the fact that unlike all of those technologies, AI companies are actually using their work, using artists' work to build this technology without their permission. And that's the major, major difference between this, the camera, and the synth, and all of these other things that get mentioned. So I'll just end by talking about where we are now. I wrote a guest column in the Hollywood Reporter the other day titled, Creators Are Losing the AI Copyright Battle. We have to keep fighting. And what I mean by that is, we're not losing in the courts. Actually, the first legal decision in the US that seems to be related to this issue, the other kind of month, actually went the way of rights holders. It's kind of a separate topic. We're not losing in the courts. We're definitely not losing in the court of public opinion. But creators are losing because governments are considering changing the law to benefit AI companies, to allow this use. The UK is a good example, where I'm from. The government has initiated a process of basically trying to change the law. It said it has a preferred outcome, which is that while AI training on copyrighted work for commercial purposes is currently clearly illegal in the UK, there's not even this debate like there is in the US, it's just illegal. They want to flip that on its head and make it legal unless creators specifically opt out of that arrangement. And I've run these opt-out schemes. When you run an opt-out scheme because you don't want anyone to opt out. Organ donation in the UK is opt-out because you want everyone's organs. So it's kind of an intentional play to essentially hand a lot of creators' work to AI companies for free. And so in response to this, one of the things we did was just in February we launched a silent album. So it was called Is This What We Want? We launched in the UK. More than 1,000 British musicians came together to put their names to this album, and we basically recorded 12 empty studios, 12 silent tracks in different locations to sort of represent what will happen to the music industry if these proposals go ahead. The track listing just read, the British government must not legalize music theft to benefit AI companies. We had incredible support from a ton of amazing musicians, both very famous and, again, like the statement, with a long tail of people who aren't household names, because this does affect everyone. And so, but we'll have to see what happens in the UK. And the government governments are nervous about missing the chance to build artificial general intelligence, and they are being sold a line by AI companies that they have to change copyright law in order to make this possible, which I think is not true. We can talk more about that. And we have to see where governments land on it. But at the moment, there is increasing organization from creators as they realize they need to make their voices heard if they want to stop what they see as the theft of their work to outcompete. So I do think there's still hope that we can alight on a path forward that works for both AI companies and the creators whose work is used. But in my mind, it has to come through, well, it has to start from a position of respect for the value of the work being trained on, and for the rights of the people who made that work. And I think at the moment that's not the position we're in. We don't have that respect. So we'll see. Anyway, that's a bit more about what I'm focused on. Really nice to have the opportunity to lay it out for you. Happy to answer any questions anyone has. Don't worry. Yes.
Wait, what is the revenue loss to AI companies when they do choose to license music?
Well, it's not really clear. I mean, the problem is at the moment, AI companies face massive headwinds if they choose to license their training data. One of the big headwinds they face, I know a bunch of AI companies who have basically, they're losing investment because they're choosing to do this. They've been explicitly told, they've gone and pitched to investors, and they've been explicitly told, unless you go and scrape training data like all these other companies are doing, we're not going to invest in you. And this is a major issue. So there's no data on the revenue loss, but we know it's a tough decision. And it's really interesting because, as I said, I've been working in this since 2010, like a long time. For the entirety of the 2010s, no one did this. No one trained on copyrighted work without permission. Even Google now have, Gemini and Bard, all these things, trained in the same way as everyone else. But Google had an AI music team, they still do. And their early work in the mid-2010s, when we were doing our work, their early work, they licensed their training data as well. They had blog posts where like, hey, here's how we got our training data, we licensed or we commissioned, So for a long time, no one did this. Everyone knew it was illegal. I've been in the community for a long time. Everyone knew it was illegal. And in 2022, basically, few companies that you've all heard of came along and sort of, threw caution to the wind. Thought, let's release these models. They've been training these models for research purposes in private, which you can more easily get away with. And then they thought, well, these are actually pretty impressive. Let's put these out. And because they raised so much money and generated so much buzz, everyone, except about 20 companies, copied them. So that's where we are. So I don't have an answer for you, but I can say that at the moment, unfortunately, people face significant headwinds if they make this decision. Just they're not in the majority.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I don't work on AI or music in general, but I do have two questions about like the use of AI and how it's related to academia, like just based on like what you're just presenting. Yeah. So the question, like my first question is, with this kind of new understanding on like the licensed and unlicensed AI, and with your idea about like transformation, as in a sense put in like the money and time invested in different kinds of creative work. So how would our standards about originality actually change with this new debate about like what exactly counts as being transformative, as compared to like originally maybe like a decade ago when we talked about like originality in academic life, sometimes we might use very like a percentage to represent like, oh, how much of work is actually being original. So that's kind of my first question, as in like, how does the concept itself change with that kind of debate? So my second question is with the problem of like creative artists using AI as well. Because what I've heard from your presentation is how like the AI and the creative artists are basically put in these two opposite camps where the AI are basically infringing on the creative artists like rights. Yeah. But I'm also thinking about it because like I would assume like creative artists actually like they would start to become more not dependent, but they would use AI a lot more. Yeah. So when it comes to this kind of question, so how exactly do we judge the use of like, and it ties back to my first question about originality as well. Because, so how do we judge the value, the aesthetic value of it in this sense, especially with this whole question about like licensing and licensing. So like a side question I would have is like, well, when the creative artist actually uses a licensed like AI to help with the work, does it make them better than those who are not using it?
Yeah. So, yeah, cool. So I think, I mean, I should start the originality point by saying I'm not an academic, so I probably know less than anyone here, maybe about this. But I mean, in general, what is absolutely clear is that AI is, if we just look at writing, AI is becoming, I mean, AI is already just used by hundreds of millions of people every week. It's used in writing across the board. The Authors Guild just had to come out with a new kind of badge that, for books that are not written with AI, because they know so much writing is starting to use AI. AI how these large language models work, is by training on huge amounts of work and basically, to put it very bluntly, giving you a lowest common denominator output. Now that's not always true. You can do things to circumvent that, but basically they're predicting the next token, they're predicting the next word. And with prediction like that comes, now you can make arguments about what is that what we are doing as people. I certainly think the processes are pretty different, while there are some similarities, of course. So in general, you've got basically a system that's being used by more and more people, that is some kind of weighted average. And as such, I think that almost inevitably, my view is that basically originality in writing goes down. Now, how you measure that, honestly, I'm probably not the best person to talk about it, but I think it's a reality that we have to just face up to. In terms of AI being used by creators, so I spend a lot of my time, basically sort of, I guess, fighting against AI companies because there's one very specific thing they are doing. I am not anti-AI. I'm not anti-using AI in creativity in general. I think there are cool use cases. I think there are interesting things to be done, interesting statements. In 2023, I published the first piece of classical music that set an AI-generated text. There are interesting people have done interesting things. A bunch of people are doing interesting things. I tend to think I find aesthetic. I think aesthetic judgments of creativity are very, very difficult to get right. They're clearly subjective. There are many people who think all AI art is terrible. I disagree with that. I think there are two ends of a spectrum. Clearly, you can simply use AI to cut loads of corners and output something. I think that has very little aesthetic value. You can use AI as part of your process in interesting ways, as many people do. And I think that obviously shifts you towards doing something interesting and something aesthetically interesting. So I think it's a spectrum. I don't think creators should shy away from using AI, and I also don't think we should judge creators who do use AI. I tend to draw a line between creators and institutions. A good example here is Christie's, the art auction house, recently ran the first fully AI art auction. There was a protest letter I signed, along with thousands of other artists, saying they shouldn't run this. They did anyway. They were always going to, but I think it was important to make the statement. It was sort of misinterpreted by some people as being an attack on some of the artists involved, which it very explicitly wasn't. I personally, and none of the other people who signed the letter, at least according to what they said, no one judges the artists for using AI in their work. What they judge is Christie's running a commercial auction, making a ton of money as an institution off many of the works in the show were created using these models. So it's about the institutions and what they are promoting. Christie's doesn't have to do that. It could run an auction of only works that were generated with models that were trained fairly. It chooses not to as an institution. So to me, that's the dividing line. I say don't judge artists for using, people will, and I get that. There are people who just hate all AI usage, and honestly, I understand it, given the strength of feeling right now. It's not how I feel. But I think, for me, there's a divide between people and institutions.
Well, first of all, thank you for this incredible presentation. And honestly, there's so much cool work that you're doing for just making it known the number of artists who don't want AI to be used for their work without some kind of licensing and just making it known to the AI companies. I guess the question is well, first, going on your point that maybe it's less fighting against all AI, but more specifically AI used in the context of this huge corporation that has tons and tons of money and can do kind of this exploitation on such a large level, as opposed to fighting small creators who train AI and fine tune on their own art to do something. I guess when we think about kind of resisting and fighting these big companies, for people who might be researchers, for people who might be software engineers at these companies, or for people who kind of do more tech stuff at any part, what do you think maybe things that you've seen in the past are like cool or like important, just like ways to use the fact that like we are working in this, like we are closer to tech to kind of, I don't know, to push back if we're not directly artists, or if we are artists, but we also have like a day job, I don't know, doing research or
Yeah.
software.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, I recently gave a talk to a bunch of basically AI music researchers at this conference for that kind of thing, and what I'll say, what I basically said to them, which is like, I think that people working at these companies have a huge amount of power here, have really can affect this more than anyone else. You know, artists can get together in massive groups all they want. To an extent, we'll always be shouting into the wind. You know, I think and what you know, less when I was running my own company because I got to make the decisions, but more when I was working at companies that you know, built AI models. I would say it is pretty hard internally. There is you know, there is actually quite a lot of support from individual researchers for these kinds of ideas. There's rarely support from leaders, from execs. You know, I was on the leadership team at Stability. You know, obviously from what they submitted to the US Copyright Office, you know, most people did not agree with me. You know, and most people don't at that kind of level in these AI companies. So it's hard, but I think really just sharing it. And as you say, like the specific reason that I brought together the statement on AI training was because they don't really do this much anymore, actually, which is great. But about a year ago, there were a lot of AI companies basically saying versions of this is good for creators. We you know, and until you organize and come out with a big statement, they can say that. Now you can't say that because you just share this statement or you share the polls or whatever. Like it's clearly not true. So I think raising this kind of stuff, you know, that is it. Pushing for change internally as much as you can. Not everyone can quit. You know, not everyone can quit their job for this, and quitting is not always the right answer because you stop being able to affect change internally, right? But I know many great researchers who are at these companies who share these views, and they're pushing bit by bit, but it's hard. So probably that's a roundabout way of saying it's really hard unless you're actually one of the execs, but you can always push. Cool. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
Both of them are at the time dimension to them, and I want to say them both and get the answer. The first one is that you said that you didn't call it generative AI back then, but in 2030, the one you were doing in the 2010s was what now is called generative AI,
Right,
but
yeah.
it was not called generative AI. So I wonder, what did you call it then?
Yeah.
And when the change happened. And the other thing is also about time and what it means. What do you think about? Because I'm thinking a lot about the names and metaphors that have thrown around about AI right now. And the second question is, there is so much also time urgency to both sides, but in very different ways. You know? Like one of the things that I hear from being stated by the big companies is this is necessary because everything's going to change. We cannot, like the government says, we can't lose this. So, and then as many people saying, or a few voices saying, actually, this all is going to crash and it's nothing. So it's almost like this new ethical transformations that we're all waiting for or not. But and so I wondered, in terms of what you did, and I think it has been very effective in your presentations and how you showed the importance of doing something and doing now and statements and what they can do in the world. But I wondered both about your views about this and how it also seems unsustainable. This, like if they got all this data at some point, what do you think is how they actually think of absorbing all this? At some point, there is no more data to be absorbed almost. But I also wonder if how it's used rhetorically from them, and if you are instead of saying we are not even looking 2 years down the line, we are thinking about the right now, even if the timeline even of the course is a different
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on the first point, we called it creative AI back then. We called it creative AI. That was the term. I actually annoyingly bought a bunch of the creative AI dot whatever web domains, sitting on them for ages, and had people started calling it creative AI. I would have been a web domain troll, you know, billionaire or something. Yeah, I mean, like, you know, but the name changed. Generative AI is what it's called, you know, and I think it's a pretty good name for what it does, separating it from kind of more discriminative AI, where you're sort of discriminating from a set instead, you know, stuff that is trained and then generates something new. Although I do think that actually the terms itself, there's a bunch of, it's slightly hard, I think, to define what exactly generative AI is. I think people have a rough idea, but it's hard to draw the line. Yeah, I mean, in terms of AI companies and hype and governments wanting to erase each other, I mean, I think it's a massive issue right now. You know, back in 2016, 2015, when I was writing about this stuff, you know, generally timelines among leading researchers for artificial general intelligence were very long compared to what we have today, you know, 50, 75 years in the future. Now you've got Demis Hassabis, you know, saying, yeah, 5 to 10 years seems reasonable, could well be sooner. You got Elon Musk saying it'll be soon. You got Jeffrey Hinton saying it'll be 10 years. Now these people could be wrong. I actually don't think they are. Many people think they are wrong. Whatever the case, we obviously don't know. But you've got the people building this, and a bunch of people who aren't building this, you know, who don't benefit from saying so. You've got a bunch of people saying, given the trajectories we're on, it's not ridiculous to assume that actually AI might be able to essentially, you know, perform all cognitive tasks within the next decade. You know, and that is, and governments see that and they think, well, that's a massive change, because it is, you know, it would be. And so they want to be the first, and I, you know, I know people in, you know, I know people who are in on the decision-making process here, and that's what's on people's minds. It's artificial general intelligence might be coming. We as a nation cannot lose that to X other nation, you know, so we have to compete. And so that's the starting point, you know, and then you've got this question, do you need to basically ignore copyright law in order to compete in AI? Now, I actually don't think you do. I think this is critical. Like, I think you, like, one, you can clearly introduce licensing frameworks that work. We've done this before with huge amounts of content. This is how things like Spotify have content. Like, it's obviously possible to license lots of stuff. There's all this evidence that licensing is possible. But also, like, many of the big, like, a good example, I think, is AlphaFold, DeepMind's AlphaFold, protein folding AI, won the Nobel Prize last year for Demis Hassabis and a couple of other people. Amazing piece of tech, not trained on any creative work, obviously. It's trained on protein structures, right? Because that's what, you don't need to train on pop songs to fold proteins, right? So there's, you know, you've got AI in healthcare, in logistics, in defense, in science, all of these things. I don't think you need copyrighted work for any of this. And I sort of have this suspicion that actually, like, at the moment, AI companies sort of say, we need all of this copyrighted work. Can't you see we need it? Because we've taken it all in and our models are improving. And honestly, I think it's kind of laziness. Like, I don't think AI companies have done much to actually ask, what could we do without doing that? Because they're trying to get away with it and they're putting all their eggs in the basket of winning those court cases, which I don't think they're going to do. You know, so I think they haven't really tried, basically, and that's the problem. And so you've got a bunch of AI companies saying to governments and basically right now it's to beat China. That's the big US things, to beat China, which again, I think is a ridiculous mischaracterization of what's going on. But this is the line, like, you've seen people literally say this, to beat China. And so the idea is you have to decimate copyright law to do that. And I just think it's pretty clearly not true. But I also think that people are very scared of losing the AI race. And I am not, you know, I am worried that governments will basically side with AI companies. You know, I think there's a real possibility of that. And I and a lot of other people are trying to do everything we can to stop that happening, basically. But I think it's obviously a possibility. You just look at the UK government's literally saying that, right? So the US government hasn't been as explicit, but there's a lot of lobbying going on. And there are rumors, and we'll have to see what happens.
Could I just ask a quick question over Zoom? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
All right.
Then
Really?
come to you.
Sorry, I hope I'm not interrupting someone. I'll be quick. You know, you mentioned obviously that the creative communities are very sensitive to this issue for obvious reasons, and that even some of the researchers within the companies are sensitive to the issue, but that sometimes where you meet with resistance is with the executives or the leaders. And I'm wondering if maybe you can or can't answer this, what you think is behind that. Is it kind of like that they're just kind of not in the world of the creative people and so not sensitive to it? Is it more what you were just saying, that they're just worried that they're going to lose a race? Is it just, you know, that they're not going to get investors behind them if they don't do this? What do you think is really driving it? And as a second part to that, if they do lose their fair use cases and have to license the work, do you think that that somewhat will resolve the issue and that a lot of this will just be done through licensing?
Yeah, so I think the 2 points you landed on are pretty much the reasons that tech execs don't tend to hold these opinions. One, most of them are not creators. There are a couple who are, but basically they're not. They have no experience of, you know, they basically don't know what it's like to, you know, live off royalty checks, basically. They just have no idea, no conception of that. And two, honestly, once you raise venture capital funding, you know, you have a fiduciary duty to your stakeholders. Your job is to increase value in your company. You're being told by your board, by your investors, you have to accelerate at all costs. And if you think there's a chance of getting away with something like that, you try it, I think, unfortunately. So yeah, I think it's those two reasons. And yeah, I mean, if these fair use cases are lost by the defendants, by the AI companies, yes, I think licensing is what would arise from that. I think you would have more licensing going on. Like we know licensing is possible. We know that training data is like basically the most valuable resource, the thing that generative AI depends on. Without it, you have nothing. Better data, to an extent, equals better models. We know there is willingness to license from rights holders. So yeah, I absolutely think that licensing is where licensing is really the only solution. There are different types of licensing. There's voluntary licensing. There's where you get to choose to go into it. There's collective licensing. There's compulsory licensing where the rights holder doesn't actually even get a choice, but they at least get paid. There are different kinds of licensing, and there's definitely a lot of nuance as to where the puck will land on that. But some form of licensing, I think, is probably the solution and what would happen.
Thank you.
Have you heard the song Now and Then by the Beatles?
Oh, have I? I have.
What do you think of it?
I think it's absolutely great. I love it. I think it's beautifully written. And I also think it's really important to note that it's not made using generative AI. It's made using the sort of AI that was used to produce the song was used basically to extract vocals from a recording. And actually it's nice because I think it's a great example of how, to me, using AI in the creative process can be a really cool and great thing. Like that doesn't exploit anyone, depending on what tools they use, but given what they used, I doubt that the tools they used were trained on people's work without a license. I certainly doubt that they were built in a way that would then compete with those people. So it seems like you got, basically a pretty good piece of tech being built and then used in this way where you bring joy to so many people. I would say, if I can say one thing on it, I mean, I love the song. I am very nervous about a world where we can continue generating output from older groups and bands indefinitely. I think that is like something that we have to be very careful of. I would not be a fan if they kept doing that, because I think that clearly crowds out the space for new artists. What do you think of it?
I just really like the song.
It's great.
Probably my favorite Beatles song.
I actually agree. I think it's a late addition to the catalog, but I agree. I think it might be one of the best. I absolutely love it. It's a great song.
Maybe this is a good place to end because we are at time. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last time was as a to go, but if not, if you also have more questions, I think that will take.
Thanks for coming, really appreciate it.
Thank you.